Hello, my friend, and welcome to the Sleepy Scholar. Tonight, we are not going to talk about nights the way you learned them. Not the nights of movie posters, all silver and thunder, galloping toward a burning castle. Tonight's subject is something quieter, and I think more interesting, the real night. The one buried under 600 years of stories other people told about him. A knight is not a suit of armor. A knight was a whole small universe of contradictions. A farmer and a warrior, a poet and a killer. A man who might spend a Tuesday negotiating the price of wheat and a Wednesday standing in a shield wall. Almost everything you think you know about him is a little bit wrong, and untangling that gently, fact by fact, is what we'll do tonight. I imagine you've had a long day. Maybe your mind is still turning over things it doesn't need to turn over anymore. A conversation, a task left undone, a small worry with no edges. That's all right. You don't have to solve any of that tonight. You don't have to think clearly at all. In fact, this whole evening works best if you don't. Some nights the mind doesn't want cosmic mysteries or hard truths. It just wants somewhere soft to wander until it forgets it was awake. So that's what we'll do. We'll wander gently through the myths and the misremembered history of medieval knighthood, taking our time, correcting nothing urgently, chasing nothing. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight, and nothing here is going to test you in the morning. And if these gentle journeys ever help you drift off, a quiet like or a subscribe helps other sleepy souls find their way here too. But that's for tomorrow, not for now. For now, just settle in. Let your body soften into whatever is holding it, the mattress, the couch, the chair that's cradling you. Let your shoulders drop, just slightly, away from your ears. Let your jaw loosen, your tongue rest heavy in your mouth. There's no need to hold your face in any particular expression anymore tonight. Let your breathing slow down on its own. You don't have to control it. Just notice it getting longer, quieter, less effortful, like a tide easing out. You don't need to remember anything I say tonight. You don't need to follow the thread if it slips away from you. And it probably will. And that's the whole point. Nothing here is a test. There's no quiz waiting for you in the morning. No one checking whether you caught every fact about swords or castles or crusades. You are allowed to miss most of this. You are allowed to fall asleep in the middle of a sentence. So let your mind drift and let's begin to wander. Here is the first thing worth softening. The word knight itself did not always mean a wealthy nobleman in silver plate. It once simply meant a mounted servant. In the earliest medieval centuries, long before castles with turrets and heraldic banners, a knight, the word comes from the Old English senet, meant something closer to boy or servant. He was often just a household retainer who happened to fight from horseback because his lord needed him to. He wasn't necessarily noble. He wasn't necessarily rich. He was, in the beginning, simply useful, a man given a horse and a weapon because someone with land needed protecting, and he was the one available to do it. It took centuries, real, slow, human centuries, for that plain word to gather all its later glamour. Knighthood grew a code around itself. It grew ceremonies, prayers, poetry, oaths. The armor got shinier as the meaning got heavier. But underneath all of it, at the root, was just a person on a horse, doing a job. There's something quietly comforting in that. The grand things we imagine from history so often started as something small and ordinary, slowly dressed up by time. Even the parts of your own life that feel unglamorous now, the errands, the waiting, the in-between hours, are, in their own way, the raw material that later gets remembered as something meaningful. But that is only one small part of the story. Here is something else worth resting on. Becoming a knight was almost never something a poor farmer's son could simply decide to do. The story we've absorbed. A stable boy proves his courage and is knighted on the battlefield, happened, occasionally, in extraordinary circumstances. But it was the exception carved in stone precisely because it was so rare. In truth, knighthood was expensive in a way that's easy to forget. A war horse alone could cost as much as a small farm. Then there was the armor, forged and fitted, and a second horse for baggage and weapons, and the years of training that began not in adulthood, but often around the age of 7, when a boy of the right family was sent away to serve as a page in someone else's household. Knighthood, in other words, was less like a job you applied for, and more like a very long, very expensive apprenticeship that almost always began with the right birth. It belonged, mostly, to a class of people who already had land, already had connections, already had horses in the stable before the boy could walk. It's a strange thing to sit with, how much of what we imagine as pure heroism was, underneath, mostly logistics. Opportunity dressed up as valor. Perhaps there's something freeing in that too, knowing that so much of what looked like destiny was really just an accident of who was born where, holding what. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a myth worth gently setting down. Knights did not need a crane, a pulley, or several men to hoist them onto their horses, because their armor was too heavy to move in. This one has lingered for a strange, long time. The image of a knight so entombed in steel that he could barely lift his own arm, let alone swing into a saddle unassisted. It isn't true. A full suit of well-made plate armor, the kind worn in the late medieval period, weighed somewhere between 40 and 60 pounds. Heavy, yes, but distributed carefully across the whole body. Shoulders and hips sharing the load the way a hiker's backpack does, rather than hanging dead weight from any one point. Modern historians, curious about this very myth, have put the armor to the test. People trained in it have run, climbed ladders, done cartwheels, vaulted onto horses from a standstill, all in full plate. It restricted movement, certainly, and wearing it for hours was exhausting in its own particular way. The way carrying anything heavy for a long time is exhausting. But it was built by craftsmen who understood the human body, hinged at the joints, tapered to let the arms swing. It was armor made to be lived in, not a steel coffin a man had to be posted into. Think of your own body for a moment, how it adapts to weight it's used to. A bag you carry every day feels lighter than it did the first week. The armored body was much the same. Trained, accustomed, capable of far more than the myth ever gave it credit for. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a softer myth to loosen. The sword was not some enormous, impossibly heavy thing that only a giant of a man could lift. Picture the swords from certain films and games, vast slabs of metal, nearly as tall as the man wielding them, swung with both effort and a kind of comic strain. The real medieval arming sword, the everyday sidearm of most knights, weighed on average somewhere between 2 and 3 pounds. Not much heavier than a bottle of wine. Even the larger, two-handed longswords rarely exceeded 4 or 5 pounds. They were balanced, weighted deliberately near the hilt, so that a trained hand could move them quickly, precisely, almost the way a tennis racket moves rather than the way a sledgehammer does. The heavy sword myth likely comes partly from museum pieces, ceremonial swords, oversized and ornamental, built for parades and display rather than battle, which understandably look enormous behind glass. And partly it comes from us simply wanting our heroes' weapons to feel impossibly hard to lift, because that makes the person lifting them feel more impossibly strong. But the truth is quieter, and in its way, more impressive, not brute strength, but years of trained precision. Skill outlasting raw force. Something worth remembering the next time your own body feels like it needs strength alone to get through something, when really what it might need is practice, patience, and time. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a myth to let go of gently. Knights did not spend most of their time locked in dramatic one-on-one combat, dueling for honor beneath castle walls. Most knights, most of the time, fought as part of larger, coordinated groups, retinues. They were sometimes called, or lances, a small unit built around one knight, but including squires, sergeants, and mounted attendants, moving and fighting together. Individual glory in single combat was rare and usually reserved for tournaments, not real war. On an actual battlefield, a lone knight charging off dramatically to face an enemy champion was as likely to get himself and his companions killed as it was to win any honor. War, for most knights, looked far less like a duel and far more like disciplined, exhausting teamwork, holding formation, protecting the man beside you, following orders you might not fully understand from a commander somewhere you couldn't see. Chaotic, loud, frightening. Cooperative in the way modern armies are cooperative, not cinematic in the way we've been shown. There's something almost comforting in that correction. The truest version of courage wasn't a lone figure standing apart from everyone else. It was staying present in your place, beside people who were counting on you. Maybe that's closer to the kind of quiet courage most of us actually practice, most days, without ever noticing it as courage at all. But that is only one small part of the story. Here is something worth unfolding slowly. Jousting, the dramatic clash of two knights charging each other with lances, was almost never how real battles were fought. The joust as we picture it, two riders thundering toward each other down a fenced lane, lances leveled, a splintering crash of wood, was a sport. A very serious, very dangerous sport, yes, sometimes fatal, but a sport nonetheless, developed as training and spectacle rather than as a description of open warfare. On a real battlefield, cavalry charges happened in loose or tight formations, depending on the moment, aimed at breaking enemy lines, not at single, isolated duels between individual champions. Tournaments themselves grew into elaborate social events, days-long festivals with feasting, music, courtly display, and enormous crowds, more like a modern sporting championship crossed with a royal wedding than a battlefield rehearsal. Kings and nobles used them to display wealth and alliance as much as martial skill. Knights could become something like celebrities through tournament success, earning fame, ransom money from defeated opponents, and marriage prospects, all without a single real war being fought that season. It's a gentle reminder that even in a violent age, people still built festivals and games and spectacle around their skills, still found ways to turn danger into performance, performance into community. Some things about being human, it seems, don't change much across the centuries. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a myth worth releasing quietly into the dark. The idea of a knight rescuing a helpless damsel in distress, sweeping her onto his horse, was mostly invented centuries after the knights themselves were gone. Much of what we now call chivalric romance, knights performing daring, rescues purely for the love of a lady, courtly devotion, secret longing glances across a great hall, was shaped less by actual medieval knights and more by later medieval poets and troubadours, writing entertainment for noble courts, and then shaped again, quite heavily, by Victorian writers and artists centuries later, who were nostalgic for an imagined, more romantic past that had never quite existed the way they painted it. Real medieval knighthood was governed by codes, certainly, but those codes centered mostly on loyalty to one's lord, courage in battle, and religious duty, protecting the church, keeping oaths, showing mercy to defeated Christian opponents specifically, the romantic ideal of chivalry, the swooning, sighing, lovesick version most familiar to us now, was largely a literary invention, polished into its final glowing shape by writers who lived long after the age of real knights had already ended. There's something almost tender in that, actually. The realization that so much of what feels like ancient tradition is really a kind of collective daydream, built slowly over generations by people imagining a past softer and more beautiful than the one that truly happened. We do this too, quietly, with our own memories. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth settling into gently. Nights bathed, regularly, and with real care, not constantly filthy as popular imagination sometimes insists. The idea of the medieval period as an era of universal grime, everyone unwashed and reeking, has softened somewhat under closer historical study. Bathing was, in fact, considered an important part of courtesy and hospitality among the noble classes. There were public bathhouses in many towns. Knighthood ceremonies themselves sometimes included a ritual bath the night before the dubbing, a literal, symbolic washing away of the old self before stepping into a new role, an echo you might recognize in ceremonies from many other traditions and eras. That's not to say medieval sanitation matched anything like a modern standard. It plainly didn't, by any measure we'd recognize today. But cleanliness was understood, valued, and practiced far more than the old, grimier stereotype allows. Herbs were used for scent, linen was changed. Hands were washed before meals as a matter of basic etiquette, sometimes with rose water poured from a special vessel kept just for that purpose. Maybe there's something worth carrying from that too, a small reminder that even in eras we imagine as rough or hard, people still cared, quietly and consistently, for their own bodies and each other's comfort. Small rituals of care have always mattered in every century, including tonight, right now, as you let your own body rest. But that is only one small part of the story. Here is something worth unfolding slowly. Not every knight was wealthy. Some were, quite literally, poor landless knights. They were sometimes called men with the training and the title, but none of the estate that was supposed to come with it. A younger son, for instance, in a family with several brothers, might be trained and dubbed as a knight, carrying all the skills and obligations of the role, while the family's actual land passed entirely to the eldest son alone, under the custom known as primogeniture. That left a whole class of capable, trained fighting men with a knight's title, and none of a knight's income men who then had to seek their fortune however they could. Some entered service in someone else's household. Some became mercenaries, hiring out their skill to whoever could pay. Some drifted, quite literally, from tournament to tournament, hoping ransom money from defeated opponents might sustain them a little longer. This gap, status without wealth, obligation without means, created real tension in medieval society and real hardship for the knights caught inside it. The shining, secure image of knighthood we've inherited leaves out this quieter, more precarious version entirely. A trained warrior with a fine title and an empty purse, uncertain where his next meal, let alone his next horse, might come from. Perhaps there's something recognizable in that too. The gap between how something looks from the outside and how uncertain it can feel from within. Status and stability are not always the same thing in any century. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a quieter fact worth letting settle. Castles were not the grim, gray, weathered stone fortresses we usually picture. Many of them were once bright, even colorful. The bare stone looks so familiar to us from ruins today is mostly the result of 600 or 700 years of weather stripping away what was originally there. Plaster, whitewash, and paint. Many castle walls, inside and sometimes outside, were coated in a bright white lime plaster, giving them a gleaming, almost luminous appearance rather than a dull gray one. Great halls were often decorated with painted scenes, tapestries, and richly colored heraldic banners. Deep reds, blues, golds, hung not for battle, but simply for beauty, warmth, and status. Heraldry itself, those colorful symbols on shields and banners, wasn't decorative alone. It served a real, practical purpose. In the chaos and confusion of a battlefield, with faces hidden behind helmets, a knight's coat of arms was often the only way to tell friend from foe, or to know which lord's men were which at a glance, from a distance. It's a small but pleasant thing to imagine, not gray stone silence, but color, banners moving in the wind, painted halls glowing by firelight. History, so often, is grayer in our imagination than it actually was in color. But that is only one small part of the story. Here is something else worth resting on gently. The phrase Dark Ages, often applied loosely to the whole medieval period, including the Age of Knights, is largely a myth in itself, or at least a serious oversimplification. The term originally described a much narrower window of time, right after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, when written records genuinely did become sparser in parts of Europe. But over time, in popular imagination, Dark Ages ballooned outward to describe nearly the entire medieval period. 1,000 years, roughly, collapsed into one vague impression of ignorance, superstition, and stagnation. In truth, the centuries when knighthood flourished were also centuries of real innovation. Advances in agriculture that fed growing populations, the founding of the first universities in Europe, sophisticated metallurgy capable of producing the very plate armor we've been discussing, complex systems of law, extraordinary cathedral architecture, engineered without modern tools, and a rich, continuous tradition of scholarship, much of it happening quietly in monasteries, copying and preserving texts that might otherwise have been lost entirely. It's worth remembering gently how easily a whole era can get flattened into a single unfair impression, simply because it's easier to remember a simple story than a complicated one. Perhaps that's true of periods of our own lives too, easy to remember as the hard years, or the lost time, when really, underneath the simple label, something was quietly still growing. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth unfolding slowly, almost like a small confession. Many knights were not the illiterate brutes of popular imagination. Quite a few could read, write, and even compose poetry themselves. While literacy in the general medieval population was low, noble households, the very households knights came from placed real value on at least some education, particularly as the medieval period wore on. Knights were expected to know courtly manners, to converse elegantly, sometimes to compose, or at least appreciate poetry and music, and to understand at least the basics of estate management, which required some capacity to read documents and keep accounts. Several famous medieval poets and chroniclers were themselves knights, writing not as an unusual exception, but as a natural extension of what a well-formed, noble education included. The stereotype of the knight as pure muscle, all sword and no sentence, tends to erase this entire, quieter dimension. The knight who might spend an evening not sharpening a blade, but composing verses for a patron, or reading aloud from a treasured manuscript by candlelight. There's something worth holding onto in that image tonight, especially strength and gentleness, force and refinement, living comfortably inside the very same person. You don't have to be only one thing. Almost no one in any century ever really was. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth settling into slowly. The famous, unsettling rite of the first night, the supposed medieval custom allowing a lord to spend the wedding night with any peasant bride on his land before her husband, has almost no solid historical evidence behind it at all. Historians who have gone looking for real documented cases of this practice across medieval Europe have found almost nothing concrete. No reliable records, no verified instances, mostly just later folklore, legend, and eventually dramatic storytelling that found the idea useful precisely because it was so shocking. It likely persisted less because it happened, and more because it made such a vivid, outrage-worthy story. the kind that travels easily from mouth to mouth, gathering conviction with each retelling, long after any factual basis has quietly fallen away. This is worth sitting with gently because it says something broader about how history gets remembered at all. The stories that survive aren't always the truest ones. Sometimes they're simply the most dramatic ones, the ones that make the best telling around a fire, regardless of how much of them actually happened. It's a small, useful thing to remember the next time any story from any century, including our own, feels almost too shocking, too perfectly awful to be entirely true. But that is only one small part of the story. Here is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a fact worth unfolding gently. Medieval war horses were not the enormous, thick-legged draft horses often shown in films. Nothing like the gentle giants used today for pulling carts and plows. Those large draft breeds we associate with heavy pulling work were largely developed later for agricultural and industrial purposes, not for war. The actual destrier, the prized war horse of a medieval knight, was closer in size to a modern, sturdy riding horse, strong and well-muscled, certainly bred and trained specifically for battle, but not the towering, cart horse-sized creature popular imagination often supplies. Skeletal remains and historical breeding records both support a horse that was capable, agile, and quick to turn, rather than simply massive. What actually mattered most in a war horse wasn't raw size at all. It was temperament and training. A horse that would not panic at the sound of horns and screaming, that could be trusted to charge toward noise and chaos rather than away from it, was worth far more than one simply large and strong. Years went into that training alone, teaching a horse to stay calm inside terror, to trust its rider completely, even when every instinct said to run. There's something quietly moving in that, actually. Courage, in the end, wasn't really about size or strength at all. It was about trust and training and staying steady inside fear. That might be true for hooves and for hearts alike. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth unfolding slowly. Knights were not always fighting for causes we would recognize today as noble or even particularly justified. Alongside the crusading knight, the tournament champion, and the loyal household retainer, medieval Europe also had its share of routiers and free companies. Bands of knights and soldiers, sometimes unemployed between wars, who turned to looting, extortion, and violence against ordinary villages and travelers simply to survive, or simply because no one was stopping them. Chivalric codes, however elegant on paper, were frequently ignored entirely. Once a knight was far from his lord's watchful authority, hungry, unpaid, and armed. Even within more legitimate warfare, knights participated in brutal suppressions of peasant uprisings, in sieges where civilian suffering was immense, in conflicts driven as much by simple greed for land and plunder as by any higher ideal. The gleaming, noble knight of legend existed largely as an aspiration, a code people wrote about and admired precisely because, in practice, it was so often violated. This isn't meant to darken the evening, only to gently round out the picture. People in every century have always been capable of holding a beautiful ideal in one hand and falling far short of it in the other. That gap between the ideal and the practice isn't a medieval failing alone. It's a very old, very human one. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something gentler to rest on. The Knights Templar and other religious military orders were not simply warriors. They were, quite literally, monks who also fought, living under vows as strict as any monasteries. Members of orders like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, exactly as a cloistered monk might, while also training and fighting as heavily armed knights, primarily in the context of the Crusades and the defense of pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Their days combined the rigid daily prayer schedule of monastic life, rising before dawn for prayers, structured hours for worship throughout the day, with military drills, weapons training, and eventually real combat. It's a strange, layered image to hold, a man kneeling in silent prayer at dawn, and hours later, mounted and armored, riding into battle. Two entirely different postures of the body, the same person moving between them, day after day, for years. The Templars in particular grew enormously wealthy and influential through donations and clever early banking practices, becoming one of medieval Europe's most powerful institutions before their dramatic and rather tragic downfall in the early 14th century. There's something worth holding onto in that dual life, discipline and devotion, stillness and action, existing comfortably inside the very same daily rhythm. Perhaps rest and effort have always belonged together more than we usually assume. But that is only one small part of the story. Let your body settle a little further now. Here is something worth resting on quietly. Knighthood was not something a man received once and simply kept forever, unquestioned. It was a status that could be earned in slow stages, formally granted through ceremony, and on rare occasions, even stripped away. The path usually began around age 7, when a boy of the right family was sent to serve as a page in another noble household, learning manners, basic combat skills, and service. Around 14, he might become a squire, attached directly to a knight, caring for his weapons and armor, learning to fight in earnest, often accompanying his knight into real battle as an assistant long before fighting himself. Only around 21, typically after years of this apprenticeship, might he finally be dubbed a knight himself, sometimes on the battlefield in recognition of proven courage, more often in a formal ceremony involving a night-long vigil, prayer, a ritual bath, and finally the accolade, a light strike, usually with the flat of a sword, upon the shoulder. It's a long, patient unfolding, isn't it? 14 years or more of quiet preparation before the moment anyone called him knight at all. So much of what looks like a single dramatic moment from the outside was really the last small step of something built slowly, for years, mostly unseen. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth settling into slowly. A squire's daily life was far more demanding and far more central to knighthood than the word servant usually implies. A squire cared for his knight's horses, cleaned and maintained his armor and weapons, helped him dress for battle, no small task alone, given how many buckles and straps full plate required, and often fought alongside him, close enough to help if the knight was unhorsed or wounded. Squires learned to fight themselves through this constant proximity, absorbing skill the way any apprentice absorbs a trade, through years of watching and doing rather than formal instruction alone. Some squires distinguished themselves in battle so clearly that they were knighted quite young, their years of quiet service suddenly, publicly rewarded. Others served for a decade or more before ever receiving the title, their contribution largely invisible to anyone outside the household, however essential it was inside it. There's something worth carrying from that too, gently, tonight. How much of any meaningful achievement rests on long, unglamorous, mostly unseen labor beforehand. The moment of recognition, when it comes, is almost always standing on the shoulders of years no one was watching closely at all. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a fact worth letting settle slowly. Knights were not always killed outright in battle when captured. Quite often, killing them was the last thing their captors wanted to do. A captured knight, particularly a wealthy or noble one, was worth far more alive than dead through the medieval institution of ransom. An enemy who captured a knight could hold him, sometimes for months or years, treated with a strange, formal courtesy given the circumstances, while negotiations proceeded for a ransom payment, sometimes enormous, to secure his release. This turned certain conflicts into something almost economic in nature, knights fighting fiercely, yes, but also, in the back of their minds, calculating who among the enemy might be worth capturing rather than killing outright. This practice created an odd, quiet incentive toward restraint on the battlefield, at least among knights facing other knights of similar rank, a kind of grim professional courtesy, one that rarely extended to common foot soldiers who held far less ransom value and were treated, tragically, with far less caution. It's an uncomfortable little detail, in some ways, mercy shaped as much by economics as by ethics. And yet, perhaps there's something almost hopeful buried in it too. Even amid violence, people found ways, however imperfect, to build in a little more restraint than pure destruction required. But that is only one small part of the story. Let your breathing settle a little further now. There's nowhere else to be. Here is something quieter still. Not every knight was a man. Though rare, and though frequently written out of later histories, women did, on occasion, take up arms and fight in ways closely paralleling knighthood. In medieval Spain, the Order of the Hatchet was reportedly founded to honor a group of women who fought to defend a town under siege when the men were away or overwhelmed. Granted noble privileges usually reserved for knights in recognition. Elsewhere across medieval Europe, individual women occasionally led troops, defended besieged castles in their husband's absence, or, in rarer documented cases, fought directly in armor themselves. Their stories survive far less completely than their male counterparts, often preserved only in fragments, footnotes, or brief chroniclers' mentions, rather than the fuller, celebrated accounts given to men. It's worth resting on gently. How much of history depends not just on what happened, but on who happened to be writing it down, and what they chose, consciously or not, to consider worth remembering at all. So much may simply be missing, not because it didn't happen, but because no one thought, at the time, that it mattered enough to record. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth unfolding slowly, almost like a small unraveling. The knight in shining, gleaming plate armor, the image most associated with knighthood overall, actually represents a relatively late, brief chapter in a much longer story. For centuries before full plate armor existed, knights wore mail, thousands of small interlocking iron rings, flexible, heavy, effective against slashing blows, but less so against the crushing force of a mace or the point of a well-aimed arrow. Full plate armor, the kind so strongly associated with knighthood in popular imagination, only reached its most advanced, iconic form in the final couple of centuries of the medieval period. A technological peak that arrived, in some ways, just before knighthood itself, as a battlefield institution, began its long, slow decline. Ironically, some of the finest plate armor ever created was being forged around the very same era that gunpowder weapons were beginning to make heavily armored cavalry increasingly obsolete on the battlefield. The most beautiful, most technically perfected version of the knight arrived almost exactly as the role itself was quietly beginning to end. There's something bittersweet and rather human in that timing. Mastering a craft most fully, perhaps, right as the world around it was already starting to change beneath it. Perfection and obsolescence arriving together, almost hand in hand. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth settling into gently. The eventual decline of knighthood as a dominant military force was not a single dramatic battlefield defeat, but a slow, uneven fading spread across nearly 2 centuries. Longbowmen, disciplined pike formations, and eventually early gunpowder weapons gradually made the heavily armored, mounted knight less and less decisive on the battlefield, not obsolete overnight, but steadily, gradually less central to how wars were actually won. Famous battles are sometimes cited as the single moment knights were defeated, but the truth was far slower and messier. Knights continued serving, continued fighting, continued holding real social and political importance for generations, even as their battlefield role diminished piece by piece. Knighthood itself didn't vanish so much as transform, shifting gradually from primarily a battlefield role into primarily a social and honorary one. A title of status and land ownership rather than an active military function, eventually evolving into forms that still exist today. In ceremonial knighthoods granted for achievement rather than combat. There's something almost soothing in that slowness, actually. How rarely real, large change happens in one dramatic moment, and how often it happens instead in a long, quiet accumulation of small shifts, barely noticed at the time, only visible clearly looking backward. But that is only one small part of the story. Let your body settle a little further now, heavier against whatever is holding you. Here is something small and worth resting on. Heraldry, those colorful symbols, animals, and patterns on a knight's shield, followed strict, almost mathematical rules, and every element usually carried real, specific meaning. Colors, called tinctures in heraldic language, followed careful conventions. Certain colors could not be placed directly against certain others to preserve clear visibility from a distance. An early, elegant kind of visual design theory developed centuries before anyone used that phrase. Animals chosen for a coat of arms often symbolized specific virtues. A lion for courage, a hound for loyalty, an eagle for nobility and vision, while specific charges, stripes, or patterns could indicate a family's history. A younger son's need to distinguish his arms from his father's, or an honor earned through some particular deed. This wasn't decoration for its own sake. On a chaotic, dusty, deafening battlefield, with faces hidden behind closed helmets, a knight's coat of arms was often the only way anyone could identify him at all, friend from foe, one lord's men from another's, at a glance, from far away, in the middle of complete confusion. There's something quietly lovely in that, a whole visual language built entirely out of necessity, refined slowly into genuine beauty. Function and art growing from exactly the same practical root. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth unfolding slowly. Knights did not use only swords. Their arsenal was varied, chosen carefully depending on the enemy, the terrain, and the moment. Maces and warhammers proved especially effective against plate armor, where a sword's edge might simply glance off smooth, curved steel. A heavy, blunt strike could still transmit enough force to injure or stun the person inside, even without piercing the metal itself. Poleaxes, long-hafted weapons combining an axe blade, a hammer head, and a spike, gave a foot soldier or dismounted knight real leverage and reach against another armored opponent. And tucked at the belt of many knights was a small, narrow dagger called a misericord, literally. Mercy, designed specifically to slip through the gaps and joints of an opponent's armor at very close range. That name has always carried a strange weight to it, mercy, given to a blade meant for a final, close, intimate act in the middle of violence. Language, even in the roughest of eras, still reaching for something gentler than the act itself, even while describing it plainly. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth settling into slowly. The popular image of a single knight, alone, riding out to face danger entirely by himself, rarely reflected how war actually worked. A knight typically traveled and fought as part of a small, coordinated unit called a lance, himself, one or two squires, and often several additional mounted or foot soldiers, all moving, camping, and fighting together as a single functioning group. Multiply this by dozens or hundreds of such units, and a medieval army becomes something closer to a complicated, layered organization. Supply lines, cooks, blacksmiths for repairs, chaplains for prayer, and messengers carrying orders back and forth. Rather than a loose gathering of individual champions, each fighting his own private battle, the romantic image of the solitary knight, alone against the world, tends to erase this whole supporting structure entirely. All the quiet, unglamorous labor that made any single knight's presence on a battlefield possible at all. Perhaps that's worth resting on gently tonight too. How rarely anyone truly succeeds entirely alone in any century, however solitary the final visible moment might look from the outside. But that is only one small part of the story. Your breathing is slower now. Good, there's no need to hurry anything. Here is something small and quiet. Nights, like everyone else, grew old. And growing old as a knight often meant setting the sword down long before death arrived at all. Many knights, once their bodies could no longer sustain the physical demands of mounted combat, transitioned into administrative roles, managing estates, training younger knights, serving as advisors rather than active fighters. Some, especially in their final years, chose to retire into monasteries, taking religious vows and spending their remaining years in quiet contemplation, a striking final chapter for a life that had spent decades in armor and violence. This slow transition, warrior to administrator to, sometimes, contemplative monk, offers a much gentler picture of a knight's whole life than the single, frozen image of a man forever charging into battle. A full human life, in other words, with seasons like any other vigor giving way, eventually and naturally, to something quieter. There's something worth holding on to in that tonight, especially as your own body settles further into rest. Even a life built around strength and action eventually, gently, makes room for stillness. That's not a failure of that life. It's simply its natural, unhurried shape. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth unfolding slowly, almost like a soft unraveling. Medieval knights were, on average, not the towering figures popular imagination often supplies. Examining surviving suits of armor from museums around the world, historians have found that many were built for men considerably shorter and slighter than modern assumptions might expect, heights that would today be considered average or even below average by most measures. Nutrition, general health, and average human height across whole populations have shifted considerably over the centuries, since, gradually, generation by generation, for reasons involving diet, medicine, and general living conditions far too broad to unpack tonight. The idea of the knight as an imposing giant, several inches taller than everyone around him, seems to owe more to the outsized cultural weight given to knighthood than to any actual physical stature. Size, in other words, was mostly symbolic rather than literal. A knight loomed large in status and meaning, whatever his true height happened to be. There's something oddly comforting in that too, isn't there? How little actual size has ever mattered to how large a presence, a reputation, or a meaning someone can leave behind them. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth settling into gently. The crusading knight, so often imagined as motivated purely by religious devotion alone, was almost always moved by a tangled mixture of motives, only some of which were spiritual. Religious conviction was certainly real and often deeply, genuinely felt, the promise of spiritual reward. forgiveness of sins, pilgrimage to sacred sites, all carried real weight for medieval Christians. But alongside faith sat other, more worldly motivations, tangled together in the very same person: the chance at land and plunder in newly conquered territories, political pressure or obligation from one's lord, family tradition, simple economic opportunity for landless younger sons with few other prospects at home. And for some, the straightforward appeal of adventure and glory far from home. Untangling any single crusader's true motive in most cases is probably impossible, and likely misses the point somewhat. People in any century rarely act from one pure, single motive alone. Faith and ambition, duty and opportunity usually arrive tangled together in the very same heart, the very same decision, impossible to fully separate from each other. Perhaps that's worth sitting with gently tonight. How rarely our own choices in any century spring from just one clean, simple reason either. But that is only one small part of the story. Let your body grow heavier now, sinking further. Here is something smaller, quieter now. Knights did not fight constantly. Most of a knight's actual year, across most of the medieval period, involved no combat at all. Real, active warfare tended to cluster into specific campaigning seasons, often spring through early autumn, when weather and available food supplies made moving armies practical. Outside those windows, and outside years when a lord was actually at war at all, a knight's daily life looked far more mundane, managing his estate if he had one, overseeing tenants and harvests, attending to legal and administrative duties, hunting, and simply waiting, sometimes for years, for the next call to serve. Long stretches of ordinary, unremarkable time, in other words, punctuating occasional violence, rather than violence itself, filling every day. Much like most lives, in most centuries, including this one, there is something else worth resting on, very softly now. Here is a small, quiet fact to rest on. The dubbing ceremony that made a squire officially a knight often included an entire night spent in prayerful vigil, alone in a chapel before dawn. The night before, a squire would fast, bathe ritually, dress in white as a symbol of purity, and then keep watch alone through the dark hours in a chapel beside his weapons and armor, praying, reflecting, preparing quietly for what the morning would formally make official. Only after this long, silent night would the actual ceremony take place, the accolade, a light strike upon the shoulder, sometimes an embrace, sometimes a formal oath spoken aloud before witnesses. There's something worth holding on to in that image tonight particularly. A whole night given over entirely to stillness and quiet reflection, right before a significant change. Rest, even then, treated as sacred preparation, not as an obstacle standing in the way of what mattered. Perhaps, in its own small way, that's exactly what tonight is too. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth unfolding slowly. A night's feasts, held in the great hall of a castle, were rarely quiet, modest meals. They were often long, elaborate social performances, sometimes stretching across several hours and many separate courses. A significant feast might include roasted meats of several kinds, elaborate pastries shaped like castles or animals, spiced wine, and dishes decorated purely for visual effect rather than flavor. A peacock, for instance, occasionally red-dressed in its own feathers after cooking, presented at the table as much for spectacle as for eating. Musicians played throughout. Minstrels sometimes told long stories or sang songs recounting great deeds, real or invented, of knights present or long dead. Seating itself carried meaning, placement near the host signaled favor, while distance from the head of the table quietly signaled the opposite. Food, in other words, was never simply food in this setting. It was status, hospitality, and theater, all served on the same table, at the same time, meant to be remembered and discussed long after the plates were cleared. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth settling into slowly. Joining certain prestigious chivalric orders required a formal, solemn oath, often sworn with a hand resting on sacred relics or a Bible, binding a knight to a specific set of obligations beyond his ordinary knighthood. The Order of the Garter, founded in England in the mid-14th century, remains one of the oldest and most famous of these. A small, elite fellowship of knights bound together by oath, ceremony, and shared symbols, meeting formally, wearing distinctive robes and insignia, existing partly as an honor and partly as a genuine, functioning bond of mutual loyalty among its members. Similar orders existed across medieval Europe, each with its own emblem, its own rules, its own quiet mythology about its founding. Membership in such an order elevated a knight's status considerably, marking him as trusted at the very highest levels, chosen specifically rather than simply born into privilege alone. There is something else worth resting on, more gently now. Here is something quiet. A knight's coat of arms was not simply chosen once and kept unchanged forever. It could grow more complicated across generations as families intermarried and combined their heraldic symbols together, a process called marshalling. When a knight married an heiress, for instance, his own family's arms might be visually divided or quartered, with hers on the same shield, creating a single combined design that quietly told the story of that alliance to anyone who knew how to read it. Over several generations, Some noble shields grew remarkably intricate, divided into many small sections, each one a small chapter of family history rendered in color and symbol rather than words. A trained eye, looking at a sufficiently complex coat of arms, could read an entire family tree in it, marriages, honors, lands, all folded into a single quiet image, carried into every battle and every formal occasion alike. There is something else worth resting on, softer still. Here is something worth unfolding slowly. The dramatic idea of two armies pausing entirely, so their greatest champions could settle a battle through single combat, sparing everyone else the fighting, happened occasionally in legend and story, far more often than it happened in real medieval warfare. Such single combats did occur on rare, specific occasions, sometimes to settle a particular dispute, sometimes as a formal legal proceeding called trial by combat, used to resolve accusations when other evidence was lacking, on the belief that God would grant victory to whichever side stood in the right. But wars themselves, the large, grinding, costly kind that decided the fate of kingdoms, were never actually settled this way. Armies did not stand down and watch two men decide their fate while everyone else went home. That tidy, dramatic shortcut belonged far more to storytelling than to the exhausting, unglamorous reality of medieval military campaigns. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth settling into gently. Historians have long debated exactly how much a single piece of equipment, the stirrup, actually changed mounted combat when it spread across medieval Europe. A reminder that even fairly well-known historical claims sometimes rest on shakier ground than they first appear to. For decades, one influential theory held that the stirrup alone, by letting a rider brace firmly and deliver the full force of a charging horse through a leveled lance, essentially created heavy mounted shock combat, and with it, knighthood itself, almost overnight. More recent historians have pushed back gently on that tidy story, pointing out that plenty of other factors, saddle design, breeding, training, social and economic change, likely mattered just as much, arriving gradually together rather than through one single invention flipping a switch. It's worth resting on gently how even the stories historians tell each other keep quietly revising themselves too, generation after generation, getting a little closer to something more complicated and more true. There is something else worth resting on, quieter now. Here is something soft. Tournaments grew so dangerous at points that the church itself periodically tried to ban them outright, worried both about the real deaths they caused and the way they seemed to celebrate violence and vanity rather than humility. Several church councils across the medieval period issued formal condemnations of tournaments, at times even denying proper burial to knights killed while competing in them, treating tournament deaths almost as a kind of self-inflicted sin rather than an honorable end. These bans were, in practice, widely ignored by the nobility, who valued tournaments too highly, both as sport and as social display, to give them up simply because the church disapproved. The prohibitions were renewed again and again across the centuries, a quiet, repeated sign of just how little effect they were actually having. There is something else worth resting on, more softly still. Here is something quiet. Not every knightly order fought primarily for religious causes in the Holy Land. Some, like the Teutonic Knights, turned their attention instead toward the forests and coastlines of northeastern Europe, fighting and settling there for generations. The Teutonic Order eventually built something closer to an independent state of its own along the Baltic coast, blending military conquest with colonization, trade, and administration. Existing for centuries as knights, landlords, and rulers all at once. Far from the deserts most people picture when they think of crusading knights at all. Knighthood, in other words, wore many different regional faces across medieval Europe, shaped as much by local geography and politics as by any single unified template. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth unfolding slowly. Some knights, particularly troubadours and trouvers active in noble courts, composed and performed their own songs and poetry, blending martial identity with genuine artistic accomplishment in the very same person. These knight poets wrote of love, longing, nature, and sometimes battle itself, performing their own compositions at court gatherings, accompanying themselves on instruments, contributing to a rich tradition of vernacular poetry that helped shape the literary languages of medieval Europe long after the songs themselves were forgotten. A knight, in this context, might be admired as much for a well-turned verse as for skill with a lance. There is something else worth resting on, gentler now, quieter. Here is something soft to rest on. Knights were often deeply superstitious, carrying relics, charms, and small prayers into battle alongside their weapons, trusting unseen protection as much as steel. Small pieces of saints' bones, fragments of cloth believed to hold spiritual power, or carefully inscribed prayers were sometimes sewn discreetly into clothing, tucked beneath armor, or carried in small pouches close to the body. Before battle, many knights attended Mass, confessed, and prayed at length, seeking not just victory, but forgiveness and spiritual protection, treating the coming violence as something requiring the soul's preparation every bit as much as the body's. This blending of steel and faith, sword and prayer, wasn't seen as contradictory at all. In a knight's own mind, Both were simply part of facing the same uncertain, frightening moment from two different directions at once. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth unfolding slowly. The mail armor that came before plate, thousands of small interlocking rings, was not the crude, simple thing it's sometimes imagined to be. Each ring in a well-made mail shirt was typically riveted shut individually, by hand. A tiny closed loop of iron linked through four of its neighbors, thousands upon thousands of times, until an entire flexible garment emerged, heavy but supple, able to move with the body almost like thick cloth. A single mail shirt might contain 20 or 30,000 rings, each one shaped, closed, and set in place separately. The labor alone, before a single battle was ever fought in it, could take a skilled craftsman many weeks. Mail excelled against slashing and cutting attacks, the rings simply refusing to part under a blade's edge. It struggled more against a narrow, focused thrust, or the blunt, crushing force of a hammer, which is part of why plate eventually developed alongside, and then partly in place of it, layered together for centuries rather than replacing each other in one clean, sudden switch. There's something worth resting on in that image tonight, thousands of tiny, careful closures, each one small and unremarkable alone, together forming something strong enough to trust your whole body to. Small, patient effort, repeated enough times, becoming something protective and whole. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth settling into gently. Knighthood, or something closely resembling it, was not unique to medieval Europe. Similar warrior classes, bound by their own codes of loyalty and honor, existed in other parts of the world during roughly the same centuries. The samurai of medieval Japan, for instance, developed their own detailed code of conduct, their own rituals around weapons and combat, their own deep intertwining of martial skill with discipline, aesthetics, and eventually poetry and philosophy. A parallel unfolding, largely independent, on the far side of the world. Neither tradition copied the other. Both arrived, separately, at strikingly similar answers to a similar question. How does a society built partly around organized violence also cultivate honor, restraint, and meaning around that violence? It's worth resting on gently how often separated cultures, with no contact between them, quietly arrive at similar solutions to similar human problems. Codes of honor, rituals of discipline, ways of making violence feel governed rather than chaotic. Something in it, perhaps, simply human, arising wherever the same conditions are present. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth unfolding slowly. Tournaments were not just violent contests. They were also, quite genuinely, fashion events, elaborate, colorful, and carefully staged for maximum visual splendor. Knights entering a tournament often wore elaborate crests atop their helmets, carved wood or boiled leather shaped into fantastical animals, wings, or family symbols, sometimes towering absurdly tall, clearly built for spectacle rather than practicality. Ladies of the court presented favors, a scarf, a sleeve, a ribbon, for a chosen knight to wear visibly into the lists, a small public gesture of favor and support, watched and noted by the entire gathered crowd. Pavilions in bright fabric lined the tournament field. Heralds announced each combatant by name and lineage, and trumpets marked the start of each pass down the lane. Underneath the danger, in other words, tournaments functioned as genuine social theater, a chance to see and be seen, to display wealth, and taste as much as skill. Not so different from the way people today might dress carefully for an important, well-attended public event. There's something almost sweet in that layering. Real danger, real display, real romance, and real practical politics, all happening at once in the very same colorful afternoon. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something quieter now. A knight's warhorse, at least a wealthier knight's, sometimes wore armor of its own, called barding, protecting its head, chest, and sometimes flanks in the same careful layered plate as its rider. Full horse armor was expensive, heavy, and reserved mostly for the wealthiest knights and the most dangerous engagements. But where it was used, it transformed horse and rider into a single armored unit, moving and protecting each other as one. Grooms and stable staff spent long hours simply maintaining this horse armor alongside a knight's own, fitting it, cleaning it, adjusting it as a horse grew or was replaced. It's easy to forget, picturing a mounted knight, that the horse beneath him was doing at least half the work of that whole fearsome image, trained for years, sometimes armored as carefully as the man riding it, trusted completely, and trusting completely in return. Courage, in that image, was never really one creature's alone. It belonged to both of them together. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is something worth settling into slowly. The actual chivalric code, at its philosophical core, was built less around romance and more around 3 or 4 fairly practical virtues: loyalty, courage, generosity, and something the medieval writers called measure, a kind of measured self-restraint. Generosity, or largesse, meant a knight was expected to be open-handed, with gifts, with hospitality, with ransom terms for a defeated opponent, with support for the poor and the church. Measure meant restraint, not losing one's temper needlessly, not indulging every appetite, keeping one's conduct measured and controlled even under pressure or provocation. These were the ideals actually written about most seriously in period conduct literature, far more than any secret glances across a crowded hall. It's a quieter, steadier version of chivalry than the one usually handed down to us. Less about sweeping romantic gestures, more about simply, consistently, being someone others could trust to behave well in small moments as much as large ones. There is something else worth resting on more softly now. Here is something small. Before ever facing a real opponent, a squire trained for years against a simple wooden post driven into the ground, called a pell, practicing the same strikes over and over, thousands of times, long before any real blade was ever crossed with another. This repetitive, unglamorous practice, the same cut, the same footwork, the same recovery, again and again against a piece of wood that could never fight back, built the deep, automatic muscle memory that real combat would later demand in an instant, with no time to think. Skill, in other words, was mostly built in silence, alone, repeating something small and ordinary, long before it was ever displayed to anyone at all. There's something worth carrying from that gently into your own rest tonight. How much of any real skill, in any life, in any century, is built in the quiet, unwitnessed repetitions nobody ever claps for. There is something else worth resting on, quieter still. Here is something soft. The famous chronicles and songs written about certain crusading opponents, including some Muslim leaders' knights fought against, sometimes described those opponents' own honor and mercy with real admiration, complicating any simple story of good knights against a faceless enemy. Accounts from the period, on both sides of these conflicts, occasionally describe moments of genuine mutual respect between opposing commanders, safe conduct granted to enemies, medical care offered to wounded opponents, formal courtesies exchanged even amid brutal, prolonged warfare. History, even in its most violent chapters, rarely divides as cleanly into simple heroes and simple villains as later retellings prefer. There is something else worth resting on, softer now. Here is something quiet still. Many knights kept falcons and hunted with them not simply for sport, but as an important marker of noble status, requiring years of patient, careful training. Falconry demanded enormous patience. A young hawk had to be slowly, gently accustomed to a human presence, trained through consistent, gentle repetition rather than force. Over weeks and months before it could be trusted to hunt and return reliably. A knight skilled in falconry was demonstrating, quietly, an entirely different kind of mastery than swordsmanship. One built on patience, careful attention, and earned trust rather than force or speed. It's a gentle image to close this particular thread on a man capable of violence in one context, and in another, spending long, quiet hours slowly earning the trust of a wild bird resting calmly on his gloved wrist. But that is only one small part of the story. Let your thoughts grow slower now, softer. There's nowhere else to be. Here is something quiet. Not every knight fought for a king or a great lord at all. Some served free cities, wealthy merchant guilds, or even, on occasion, the church directly, rather than any single noble household. Certain wealthy medieval towns and city-states, particularly in regions where merchant power rivaled or exceeded traditional noble authority, maintained their own knights and men-at-arms, answerable to a city council rather than a single lord. This blurred the tidy, familiar picture of knighthood as existing purely within a strict feudal chain, lord above, knight below, into something a little messier, a little more varied, shaped by local circumstance as much as by any single universal rule. There is something else worth resting on, even more quietly. Some knights, later in the medieval period, became closely associated with early gunpowder weapons themselves, rather than resisting them entirely, as popular imagination sometimes suggests. Far from uniformly rejecting firearms as dishonorable, many noble and knightly families adapted, incorporating early cannons and handheld guns into their own forces, funding their development and adjusting tactics gradually rather than clinging only to the sword and lance out of stubborn pride. Change, even significant change, was absorbed more often than resisted outright. There is something else worth resting on, quietly. Here is something small. In Iberia, the long centuries of conflict and coexistence, often grouped loosely under the term Reconquista, produced their own distinct knightly orders. Santiago, Calatrava, Alcantara among them, each blending religious vows with military service in ways shaped by that region's particular tangled history of shifting borders and shared cultures. These orders held vast lands, managed considerable wealth, and functioned almost as independent institutions within their kingdoms, answering partly to the crown and partly to their own internal rules and grand masters. Knighthood here looked, in many small ways, distinctly different from its counterparts further north. Its own architecture, its own ceremonies, its own particular blend of faith, war, and land management, shaped by centuries of a frontier where cultures met as often as they clashed. There is something else worth resting on, more quietly. Here is something soft. A knight's oath of fealty to his lord was not a vague, informal promise. It was a specific, ritualized ceremony, usually involving kneeling, placing his hands between his lord's own, and speaking fixed, formal words witnessed publicly by others. This ceremony, called homage, created binding mutual obligations on both sides. The knight owed loyalty, counsel, and military service. the Lord, in turn, owed protection, justice, and support. It was less a one-directional demand and more a formal, reciprocal bond, taken seriously enough that breaking it carried real social and even legal consequences. A betrayal not just of a person, but of an entire understood structure holding medieval society together. There is something else worth resting on, gently now. Here is something quiet, contrary to a common assumption. A knight's helmet was not simply clamped onto his head and forgotten. Different helmet designs served very different purposes, and knights often switched between them depending on the moment. A great helm, fully enclosing the head, offered excellent protection, but limited vision and airflow, better suited to the brief, intense moments of a cavalry charge than to prolonged fighting. Lighter, open-faced helmets offered better awareness and breathing for longer engagements, at some cost to protection. Wealthier knights often owned several, choosing deliberately based on the specific demands of the battle or tournament ahead, much the way a craftsman might choose deliberately among several different tools for different parts of the very same task. There is something else worth resting on, softer still. Here is something small. After death, some knights chose to have their hearts buried separately from the rest of their body, often in a different location entirely. Sometimes a beloved chapel, sometimes a distant battlefield, sometimes a place tied to a crusade they had once hoped to complete. This practice, called heart burial, reflected a genuine medieval belief that the heart held special spiritual significance, worth honoring in its own separate resting place, even while the rest of the body lay elsewhere. Small lead or metal containers, sometimes beautifully decorated, held these hearts, interred quietly in chapels built or endowed specifically to receive them. There's something oddly tender in that image tonight. A person choosing in advance to leave a small part of themselves somewhere meaningful, separate from where the rest of them would finally rest. There is something else worth resting on now, quieter, slower. Here is something soft. The very last knights of the medieval period increasingly found themselves fighting alongside gunpowder weapons rather than purely against them, blending old and new forms of warfare together for generations before the mounted, armored knight finally faded from battlefields entirely. Full plate armor, remarkably, continued to be worn well past the introduction of early firearms, offering real protection against lower velocity shot for some time, gradually thickened and reinforced in certain areas, specifically in response to gunpowder weapons, before eventually, slowly, becoming impractical as those weapons kept improving. Change arrived, as it so often does, not as a single door closing, but as a long, gradual dimming, one adjustment at a time, across careers and generations rather than any single afternoon. There is something else worth resting on, gently. Here is something small. Many knights carried personal mottos, short phrases in Latin or French inscribed on their arms, banners, or even the blade of a favored sword, meant to capture, in just a few words, the guiding idea of how they hoped to live and be remembered. Some mottos spoke of loyalty, some of courage, some of humility before God, some simply of steadfastness. A small, private compass carried into every public moment. It's a gentle thing to imagine. A single short phrase chosen carefully enough to be worn for a whole lifetime. A reminder returned to again and again, in calm moments and difficult ones alike, of who a person meant to be. There is something else worth resting on, more quietly. Here is something small. A knight's own sense of identity was tied closely to his lineage, and losing that lineage through dishonor, debt, or defeat could feel, to him, like a kind of erasure far worse than physical death. A fear that shaped much of how knights behaved in public far more than any single battle did. Public reputation, passed down through family name and remembered deeds, mattered enormously in a world without photographs, without recordings, without any way to preserve a life except through memory, story, and the occasional carved stone. A knight's careful attention to honor in this light looks less like vanity and more like a quiet, constant effort to be worth remembering accurately by people he would never meet long after he was gone. There is something else worth resting on, gently, unhurried. Here is something small. A knight's shield, in its earlier medieval form, was often a large, kite-shaped design, curved and elongated to protect the leg, as well as the torso while mounted. Only later shrinking into the smaller, more familiar heater shape as plate armor improved and the legs gained their own separate protection. This slow shrinking of the shield across generations traced, quite directly, the slow improvement of armor itself. As plate covered more of the body, the shield needed to cover less, freeing it to become lighter, more maneuverable, easier to carry, and angle quickly in a fight. Two pieces of equipment evolving together, each adjusting quietly to the other's changes, the way two long partners might slowly adjust their habits around each other over many years. There is something else worth resting on, quietly, gently now. Here is something small. Medieval physicians and surgeons attached to noble households or armies had developed real, practical skill in treating battle wounds, cleaning cuts, setting broken bones, even performing early forms of surgery. Long before anything resembling modern medicine existed, working instead from centuries of accumulated, careful, hands-on experience. Herbal remedies, wine used as a crude antiseptic, and honey, whose natural properties happen to help prevent infection, even though no one understood why at the time, were common treatments. Wounded knights who survived the initial injury and infection often recovered more fully than popular imagination. Quick to assume medieval medicine meant near certain death usually allows. Care, however different from today's, was still real care, attentive, patient, doing the best it could with what it had. There is something else worth resting on, softer. Here is something quiet. Squires and young knights sometimes trained together in mock battles using blunted weapons, specifically designed to allow real, forceful practice without the same risk of serious injury as a sharpened blade carried. These blunted tournament weapons still delivered genuine impact, genuine bruising, genuine exhaustion, enough to build real skill and real toughness, while reducing, though never eliminating, the chance of a fatal wound. It was, in its own rough medieval way, an early form of safety equipment, born from the same simple wish every era seems to share: to practice something dangerous seriously, without needing every practice session to risk everything at once. There is something else worth resting on now, gently, barely above a whisper. The image carved onto a knight's tomb, hands folded, sword resting quietly at his side, eyes closed in permanent, peaceful stillness, was itself a carefully chosen final message. One last quiet statement about how he wished to be remembered. Effigies, these stone or bronze tomb sculptures, were commissioned deliberately, often before death, choosing exactly which symbols, which posture, which small details would speak for a person across centuries, once their actual voice had gone quiet forever. A final, careful curation of memory. There is something else worth resting on now. Above you, the universe is steady and calm. It has been unfolding for billions of years, long before the first knight ever rode into battle, long before the first castle wall was raised, and it will keep unfolding long after tonight, long after every worry currently sitting in your mind has quietly dissolved into something else entirely. Your mind, after all, is really just a small, tireless machine, trying all day to predict what's coming next, trying to keep you safe by staying one step ahead of the world. That's all it's doing right now, even here. It doesn't need to keep doing that quite so hard tonight. It's allowed to stop guessing. It's allowed to just listen softly to a slow voice and let the predicting quiet down for a while. There is something else worth resting on, so gently now. You can let all of this soften now. You don't need to hold on to any of it. Not the knights, not the armor, not the horses, not the myths we untangled together. Let it all blur gently into a single warm impression, the way a whole day sometimes blurs by nightfall into just a feeling rather than a list of facts. There's no need to hold anything tightly anymore tonight. Let your body sink a little further. Let your breathing stay slow, unhurried, easy. Let your shoulders stay soft. Let your jaw stay loose. Let the day, whatever it held, finally loosen its grip on you completely. Somewhere out there tonight, the earth is turning quietly, the way it always does, the way it always will, whether you're awake to notice or not. Stars that started shining long before any castle was built are still shining now, steady, patient, unhurried. Time is passing gently, the way it always passes, asking nothing of you at all. You don't have to hold on to tonight either. You can let it go now, the way you let go of everything else. Your body already knows how to rest. Sleep well, and good night.